panel speaker today is Peter Sandeman, Chief Executive Officer for Anglicare. Thank you.
I'm also a deacon in the Anglican Church, but I have no authority whatsoever to speak on their behalf. So the views are entirely my own, hopefully shared by others. I want to follow on from our previous two speakers by talking about the South Australian context. So we live in the paradise of dissent. So South Australia was formed very much on the basis of no established religion. And if the Anglicans had our way, we would have had our cathedral in the middle of Victoria Square, just like they do in Wellington, New Zealand. But the then bishop was very firmly told that wasn't the case, and they had to buy land at North Adelaide, which is quite a good site, but it's not the centre of the city. The prevailing views at the time were quite contested as to the establishment of religion. The language used then and now was secular. I think the use of the term has varied, and Rick and David may correct me on this, but it used to be that secular meant not partial to any particular religion, not that, whereas now secular seems to be no religion. So there is a challenge for faith communities in the growing concept of secular as no religion at all. So not the kind of rich partnership that Rick was talking about, but an exclusion of religion from public life. It's a big challenge. So when the marriage equality legislation, the survey was enacted, I think there was a big shock to some people in the larger established religious organisations that somehow there was a confidence that of course the community would agree with them because they spoke for the community. And it was a very large shock when the majority of Australians voted against the precepts of the larger established Christian churches and some other religious communities as well. Previously, those same church organisations had advocated strongly against the type of legislation they now want. So it's only 10 or 15 years ago that the majority mainstream Christian churches argued very strongly against religious discrimination legislation on the basis they were in the majority, they had the rights, and they wanted the ability to slag off against other views. It's only now that the churches believe that, as mainstream churches believe they are in the minority perhaps, that they've felt the need for the protection of the state. It's a really difficult issue because if, for example, we took the Quaker view and simply amended the Racial Discrimination Act, then each person who felt offended by a religious organisation, I feel terribly offended by what you've said, could take action against that person. And as I've argued in an article I did for the Advertiser about a month ago, by its nature, religion tends to be offensive to those who do not share those beliefs. The fundamental beliefs of Christianity are offensive to non-Christians, and so by its nature we tend to take offence to precepts that we don't share. It's part of human nature. People have the wrong belief, so we take offence at the wrong belief because we have the right belief. So it makes this area can be very contentious. So the framing that I would prefer, rather than religious freedom, is freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly for everyone. So we would be free to assemble in the Quaker meeting house. We would be free to have a meeting like this and to discuss what we believe. And we would be free to say what we believe. Now, there are always limits to freedom of speech. The famous one, which I think Rick will drag out, is you're not allowed to say fire in a crowded theatre and cause a stampede and injury to people when there isn't a fire. So there is always community safety. And if you look at the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which is the basis from which a lot of this discussion happens, Australia was a signatory, an early signatory to that covenant. It does postulate religious freedom, but it is balanced by the rights of others. So we need to take that into account. I really do believe it would be wiser if this was about freedom of thought, freedom of belief, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly, which are universal human rights, not privileging religion over other human belief systems. So, and to have a degree of mutual tolerance of disagreement about belief is really important in any community. And to some extent, what you have, I believe, is the attempt to actually privilege certain beliefs over other beliefs. And I think that's naive, and I also think it's dangerous. If you go to some of the specifics of the legislation for an organisation like Anglicare, so Australia is quite unique in that the large faith-based organisations tend to be Christian-based organisations because of our colonial history. We provide a large amount of non-government services in the community. And although the church's influence over those institutions is fading, and fading quite fast, it is still substantial. And the latest draft of the bill defines organisations like Anglicare as religious bodies, whether we want that title or not. So it goes from churches and synagogues and mosques and temples and expands it to welfare organisations, hospitals and schools associated with those churches and mosques and temples, etc. So it's a rather large expansion of definition of what is a religious organisation. And then it allows an Anglicare type organisation to take religious belief into account when hiring. So I would be empowered to say, I wouldn't want to do this, but I'd be empowered to say, only Anglicans, no Quakers, thank you very much. I would be able to impose conduct rules requiring workers to meet the religious ethos. And so, I'd find a way of excluding Rick from polluting the organisation. It allows health professionals to refuse treatment based on religious belief. And that will get very contentious in terms of where you have religious-based health organisations who are the only game in town. And it allows, this is the core of the matter, I believe, it allows schools to discriminate against students based on religious beliefs. Now, it's not so long ago when the federal Labor government tried to consolidate all the human rights legislation to one gigantic act. Part of that was the aged care legislation. And the submissions that went through, to my shame, from the Sydney Diocese of the Anglican Church of Australia, and Anglicare Sydney and several other people, was to say, well, we should be able to discriminate on the basis of sexuality in aged care. It's utterly ridiculous. By the time people are sick enough to get into aged care facilities these days, the last thing you have to worry about is sexual activity on the whole. Food, very important. But that was really shadowboxing around the real issue, which is schools. Schools are the battleground. I think I'll leave it there, and we can open up for general discussion or questions.